9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Coming up for you in the next hour, celebrations in North Yorkshire this afternoon. Plans for a massive new asylum centre on the site of a former RAF base have been dropped. Also, why plans to de-radicalise convicted Islamists in prison are not working. A new report says they are simply refusing to take part. I'll speak to Phil Ingram, who's a former senior military intelligence officer, about that. Also, FBI officers, they've raided Donald Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Our own Nigel Farage says it's a reflection of how America's deep state works. James Dellingpole will be my guest. And the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham drew to a close last night. Flag bearers, fireworks, surprise performance from Ozzy Osbourne's Black Sabbath. But there was a better way, was there, of spending the best part of £1 billion on Birmingham. With me for the next 2 hours, the author and broadcaster Christine Hamilton. But first, the latest news headlines.
It's 4:01. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. Controversial plans to house hundreds of asylum seekers at a former RAF base in Yorkshire have been abandoned. GB News understands the Ministry of Defence has withdrawn permission for the Home Office to use the base at Linton-on-Ouse. The community has been campaigning against the move, which they say would have housed 1,500 people, jeopardising the safety of the village. Well, the number of migrants crossing the Channel this year is on course to hit 20,000 within a week. It's after almost 400 people were intercepted yesterday. Sources on the French side of the Channel say thousands are currently camped around Calais and Dunkirk, waiting to make the journey. A cordon around the site of a house explosion in South London has been extended following the discovery of elevated gas readings. A girl, thought to be 4 years old, was killed when the terraced home collapsed in Thornton Heath yesterday. 3 other people were taken to hospital. Residents say they could smell gas for at least 2 weeks before the incident. The cost of living crisis is expected to get worse, with a consultancy firm warning energy bills could hit £4,200 in the next year. That's around £650 more than Cornwall Insight had previously forecast. It comes after energy regulator Ofgem announced it's changed the way it calculates the price cap. Energy bills are then expected to be slightly lower in the second half of 2023. Tory leadership candidate Liz Truss says if she becomes PM, her priority will be to help households.
Well, what I'm doing is making sure people are paying less taxes and also having a temporary moratorium on the green energy levy to save people money on their fuel bills in advance. We'll see what the situation is like in the autumn. But I'm committed to making sure people are supported, and I'm committed to growing the economy.
Well, Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab says Ms Truss's plans to cut taxes would be an electoral suicide note.
I think public enemy number one is inflation. We've got to get inflation down. If we don't, then it eats away at people's savings. Any money that is handed back to people through tax cuts will be taken away with higher inflation and higher interest rates on the other hand. And of course, we've got an election in 2 years' time. People are going to judge us on the credibility and the fairness with which we approach the current global challenges with inflation, but which, of course, hitting people up and down the country in the UK.
Defence Secretary Ben Wallace doesn't agree. He says it's wrong to claim Liz Truss's emergency tax-cutting budget risks damaging the Tory party.
You know, I'd say a gentle warning to Rishi's camp that, you know, blue on blue is not going to help the Conservative Party win the next election. You know, we have to maintain our brand. I think those type of attacks are unnecessary and actually, I think, say more about, you know, that team than it does about Liz Truss.
Thames Water plans to announce a hosepipe ban in the coming weeks. 2 other companies have already imposed bans as a result of the prolonged dry weather. With temperatures expected to reach the mid-30s, the Met Office has issued a 4-day amber warning for extreme heat across parts of England and Wales from Thursday. A heat health alert is also in place, with vulnerable people being warned they could be adversely affected by the warm conditions. The court has heard there were red flags in the relationship between former Manchester United footballer Ryan Giggs and his ex-girlfriend. Kate Greville says she told detectives it was almost like he was 2 people. She was interviewed 2 weeks after he allegedly headbutted her in November 2020. He's on trial, accused of assaulting Ms. Greville and her younger sister Emma. He denies the charges. The NHS has virtually cleared the backlog of people waiting more than 2 years for a routine operation. In January, more than 22,000 people had been waiting 2 years or longer for scans, checks and surgery. Now there are fewer than 200. Earlier this year, the NHS published a recovery plan to tackle the pandemic backlogs. The next aim is to eliminate 18-month waits. And some breaking news for you now. In the last few minutes, Hertfordshire Police have announced that a 14-year-old boy has died close to a lake in Chestnut last night. Police and fire services were called at 5 p.m. yesterday after a boy failed to resurface from being underwater. Formal identification has not yet taken place, but the family have been notified. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Colin Brazier.
Really good afternoon to you. Now, GB News can confirm that controversial plans to house hundreds of asylum seekers at a former Royal Air Force base next to a Yorkshire village have been abandoned. Let's go straight to our Home and Security Editor, Mark White, in the studio with me, as is Christine Hamilton today, which I imagine means you'll be throwing your 2 penneth in, Christine. They're happy at Linton News, I imagine, Mark, are they?
They are absolutely delighted. Yeah, I've been speaking to a few of the villagers over the last few hours, and yes, dreams come true. They were very, very concerned about the prospect of 1,200 young men moving into that RAF base. The village itself is only about 500 people. They've got 1 shop, no other facilities in the village. And of course, the people in the base, they would be free to come and go. And many of them, they felt, would be hanging around the village. And there was a potential risk because although the vast majority are probably law-abiding, it only takes 1 or 2 for there to be disruption. It's not happening, though, because really what has happened now is the Ministry of Defence have pulled the rug under Priti Patel. So that is not going to happen. They had, I'm told, agreed back in December of last year that they would make the base available. It was a cross-government agreement. Then announced in April by Boris Johnson and Priti Patel to great fanfare, a 2-pronged attack against the small boat crisis. One aspect of that, of course, to send potentially thousands of people off to Rwanda. What's happened to that? Mired in legal ructions at the various courts, so not happening anytime soon. And then, of course, you have Linton on News. This was their way of dealing with the immediate crisis, which is costing the taxpayer about £5 million every day to house. When we did a report about 2.5 months ago, it was 30,000 hotel rooms a day are being requisitioned by the Home Office. Since we did that report, close to 10,000 more people have come across the English Channel in small boats, all requiring accommodation, and many of those will be put in hotel accommodation. So this was one solution, or partial solution, that the Home Office, the Home Secretary, felt could work. Getting a mass of people into redundant facilities like an old military base, much cheaper to do that. If you're in the village, though, absolute nightmare for them. But, hard choices had to be made. That's what Priti Patel thought she was doing. But now, at the 11th hour, the Ministry of Defence have decided, no, you're not having our base.
And does that mean if you live cheek by jowl with an old RAF base or old army base, you ought to be worried a little bit that perhaps this is coming to you soon.
I think you can probably actually breathe a big sigh of relief now, because I think it's clear what the Ministry of Defence think of those plans. If it doesn't want Linton on Ouse used, does it want any other of its establishments used? Probably not. As I understand it, clearly Priti Patel is very disappointed by what has happened. But more than that, they're now scrambling about, trying to think, what on earth are we going to do? Because you can't just, summon up something that is suitable to house 1,200 people. Yeah. An old redundant base is perfect because there's all the old accommodation that the RAF personnel were in. Apart from old military bases, there are not many areas that are that have all that kind of free accommodation. So trying to think of where you go next to house a significant number of people is not going to be easy.
Christine Hamilton, a victory for the villagers of Linton on Ouse, but maybe a defeat for the taxpayer.
Well, this is a almost mirror image to what happened a couple of years ago at a place called Penally in South Wales near Tenby, where they were going to do almost the same. I think, if I remember correctly, it was when Neil was in the Welsh Parliament, it was in part of his patch. There was about 800 people in the village, same sort of thing, one shop, one pub. All these young teenage or early 20s young men suddenly arriving. As you say, it only takes one. They've got nothing else to do. It's an absolute recipe for disaster. They did arrive at Penally, but very shortly afterwards it was closed. So what are they going to do? What they have to do is turn the tap off on the other side of the channel. Possibly.
Yes. They absolutely do. They need French cooperation and agreement, really, to take the migrants back that arrive on our shores, because without that, they're going to keep on coming.
Get the French to deliver some value for all the money we've given them to try and deal with the problem.
Mark, you'll keep us posted. I know it's a story that's evolving all the while, and as you explained to us yesterday, at least the French police were seen puncturing some of those dinghies on the shoreline of France.
Hooray. I didn't know that.
Let's not get carried away. One boat.
Oh, one.
Just the one.
Okay.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. Let's move on to a different kind of story, a different kind of country. The FBI has raided the home of the former American President Donald Trump. Agents executed a search warrant, entered the house and broke open the former president's personal safe. The search is reportedly connected to an investigation into Mr. Trump's handling of official papers. Let's turn to Matthew Schmidt, who's the founder of Compact magazine. Matthew, welcome to you. What's the reaction to this in the States?
Well, thanks for having me. It's occasioned a great deal of controversy, especially on the right. Supporters of Donald Trump are extremely worried about it. And meanwhile, we've seen a quieter response from the leaders of the Democratic Party. They're taking a wait-and-see attitude. And I think it's important to realize that we don't have the essential facts. We don't know. We haven't seen the warrant that was executed on Trump, and we don't know anything about the underlying information. The imperative thing at this moment is that that information be made public, both by Trump and by the Department of Justice.
Do you think, Matthew, what's the supposition as to what they were going after?
Right. So, as you say, it seems to be documents that he removed from the White House. It's, an interesting case because, of course, this was a controversy in the 2016 campaign against Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. There was much talk of Hillary Clinton's emails and of a server on which these emails were kept. These emails were concerning government business, but they hadn't been stored on government servers and that business hadn't been conducted through a government account. So we're seeing really a return to the same issue. How is official information, how is classified information being handled? And I think we're seeing yet another moment in which the public's trust in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and in the Department of Justice is going to be severely damaged.
Yeah, and presumably Mr. Trump's supporters are saying, once again, the integrity of the highest office in the land is being questioned to a corrosive degree.
Right. I mean, the FBI has a very long-standing positive image in American culture. It's the kind of man dressed in a nice suit who, has an Irish name and is a straight shooter, chews gum. But over time, that image has really changed, and we've seen increasing politicization of the FBI, not only against the right, but the FBI's promiscuous interference in political affairs. And I think that, once we have a Republican majority in the House, or once there's a Republican in the presidential office, there will probably be a more concerted move against the intelligence agencies.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth labouring the point, Matthew, isn't it, for those of us on this side of the Atlantic, that it's such a different system, the idea that with each new administration, effectively, to a great degree, at least in the upper echelons, comes a kind of new civil service.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the way it once was, and there's a great deal of controversy over whether it should be that way again. People on the right, including Trump, want to have more freedom to replace top civil servants. People on the left are generally more opposed to that, and that's for a very simple reason. Civil servants in the U.S., very much including people described as part of the intelligence community, tend to align with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is much more a party of the state, a party of the civil service, and the Republican Party is more populist and more opposed to both the intelligence agencies and the federal agencies more broadly.
Matthew, just in terms of the way this looks politically, if Mr. Trump is, as has been widely suggested, looking to run again, this absolutely endorses his candidature, doesn't it? I mean, this is deep state stuff. If you are a Trump supporter, his home, his own personal safe, has been violated on the orders of the state.
Indeed, the words banana republic are being widely used. This is unprecedented in America. This is a real step across Rubicon on the part of the Biden administration and his Department of Justice. It's being said that no man should be above the rule of law. That's true, but there's been a classic presumption in America that it's disadvantageous to criminalize former presidents. That's why Richard Nixon was pardoned after Watergate. Of course, Watergate stemmed from a confrontation between a disaffected FBI official and Nixon. That's who leaked the information to Woodward and Bernstein. And so as in Watergate, we're seeing a confrontation between the intelligence agencies and a president who is disliked by them, or in this case, a former president.
Matthew, would Joe Biden, I mean, just in terms of, we're almost out of time, but yes, no, or don't know, would Biden have signed off, or would he have known in advance this operation was happening?
I am sure that he will say he did not know in advance, but it is implausible to believe that the Department of Justice would have proceeded with this without his at least tacit acceptance of it.
Matthew Schmidt from Compact Magazine. Really appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Christine Hamilton alongside me. Christine, I think we obsess too much about American politics oftentimes in this country, but this is one of those stories when we look at the most advanced developed nation in the world, a standard bearer for democracy, and we shake our heads.
I don't think we do obsess too much about American politics, do we? I mean, it's incredibly important and it's fascinating.
I think we obsess. When you listen to radio phone-ins, and there'll have been them today, where people say, let's change, they talk about it as if it's our country. You know, that something happens to gun laws. Our law, they behave as, it's 4,000 miles over there, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, very often what happens over there comes over here. But I mean, it is quite incredible. In order to do that in this country, you would need one of the most fearsome. The police would need the most sort of extraordinary...
Could you imagine hearing that the Met Police have knocked on Tony Blair's... They've gone into his house and gone into his safe.
They haven't even said, will you open the safe for me? Apparently, they forcibly opened it. They must have taken a safecracker with them. It is incredible to believe that it's happened. Quite extraordinary. But it can happen in this country. Our own house was raided by the police and they took everything they wanted, computers, etc. They got some warrant that is normally used for, you know, people who are drug smuggling or about to leave the country or whatever. Yeah. So, I mean, it can happen. But then... the President of the United States, I mean, it is quite incredible. Of course, Biden knew about it. They wouldn't dare do it without him.
We're almost out of time, but we're going to be talking to James Delingpole about this, the columnist, soon. Nigel Farage earlier today talked about this being the deep state in operation. It was a phrase actually used by Boris Johnson last month. It's been used for years, hasn't it? But for some people, it's out there. It belongs to conspiracy theory land. Do you believe in the idea of... Is there such a thing as a deep state?
Yes, I think there certainly is. I mean, there are certainly people under there, as it were, under the radar, seeking to undermine our way of life. Absolutely. Some of them are in what's called the blob.
Christine, thanks very much indeed. Much more coming up, including this. Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss going head-to-head again. Latest round of the Tory leadership hustings will speak to the leader of Darlington Council. The hustings are being held there. First, it's getting warmer this week, and here is the weather.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. Lots more blue sky to come and lots more rising temperatures. We have just issued here at the Met Office this morning an extreme heat warning for Thursday until Sunday, where temperatures will again get into the mid-30s across parts of the south, potentially causing disruption. High pressure is controlling our weather, and as we go towards Friday and Saturday, we tap into slightly hotter air, so the temperatures will just go up a notch. Back to this evening, and for most it's a balmy summer's evening, a bit breezy across Kent and certainly breezy across northern Scotland, where there is quite a lot of cloud. May even be one or two light drizzly showers here and there. But for most it's a dry evening, a dry and a clear night as well. Maybe some mist and fog patches forming through the early hours. Quite a warm one, temperatures staying in the teens in most urban areas. Certainly a very warm day to come on Wednesday. Any early morning mist and fog across the east should disappear, as it should across Northern Ireland. The cloud in northern Scotland, though, is likely to stick around over Shetland, the Western Isles, but should turn brighter, I suspect, over northern parts of the mainland up through Orkney and elsewhere. Just lots and lots of sunshine, hot sunshine as well. Temperatures a few degrees up on today's values, getting into the low 30s across parts of the south. The coast will always be a little cooler. The cloud and rain will just trickle a little further into parts of northern Scotland during Wednesday evening. Otherwise, again, most places having a fine Wednesday evening, leading to another hot and sunny day on Thursday. Again, just parts of eastern England could be susceptible to a little bit of low cloud and mist, and a bit more of a breeze coming into eastern areas will maybe reduce the temperature across the East Anglian coastline a little bit on Thursday. But elsewhere, again, another hot day with temperatures more widely over 30 Celsius across the south and generally in the mid to high 20s quite widely. A little cooler with that thicker cloud across the far north of Scotland. Lots more sunshine to come as we head into the weekend. And as I said at the start, temperatures rising that much further. For more details on that warning, check out the Met Office website.
Tonight on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
No question what story has really got your goat today. It's those plans to house asylum seekers at a former RAF base in North Yorkshire, Linton-on-Ouse. There were plans and it was going ahead. But But not anymore. The MOD have pulled the plug. There will no longer be 1,500 predominantly young men cheek by jowl with a village of just a few hundred. June says maybe now the government has abandoned plans to house asylum seekers at Linton-on-Ouse. After spending money refurbishing it, they should instead house veterans that are in need of accommodation. Roger says, I think that illegal immigrants have already demonstrated that they are not law-abiding and they do not care or respect laws. Alex says, now what about the asylum seekers housed in other parts of the UK? I think they'll be staying here for at least another 5 years. Well, you have to admire their stamina, if not always their policies. Once again, the two people who would lead the country face an audience of Conservative Party members. Tonight, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, they'll be in Darlington in County Durham. Earlier today, Liz Truss hit back at accusations from the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, that her plans for an emergency tax-cutting budget would be electoral suicide. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak has suggested that he would consider increasing direct support for families in order to reduce the hardships that many families will encounter across the course of the winter. Let's turn to the Conservative leader of Darlington Council, that is Jonathan Dalston. Jonathan, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Are we allowed to ask you who you're voting for, who you favour of the two?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of weeks I declared that I'll be supporting Rishi Sunak because I think he's done a fantastic piece for Darlington with the launch of the Darlington Economic Campus, which is already seeing hundreds of jobs already coming to Darlington. So he's championed that from day one. So it's the obvious choice for us in the north.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of sending Treasury jobs up to County Durham, I mean, that's a big deal for your area, isn't it? But beyond that, what does it stand for that you like?
I think he's really forward-thinking, and I genuinely believe he's responsible with making sure that the finances of the country are balanced and we don't make all of these commitments. We understand that we've been through a global pandemic and that has absolutely caused significant challenges to the public purse. But Rishi wants to do it in a responsible way, and I think some of the policies that he's outlined during this campaign I recognise and support. So for that reason, alongside his commitment to level up the north, to level up the country, but particularly the north, is why he's getting my vote.
Do you accept, though, that your vote is probably a vote into the howling teeth of a gale, in the sense that Liz Truss has pretty much got it signed and sealed, if the polls are to be believed?
Well, it's a difficult one, because if we listen to the media, it would suggest that it's a done deal. If we listen to colleagues within the party, it's far from a deal. And if anything, it's actually the other way. I'm hearing lots of colleagues saying that Rishi's doing exceptionally well, and the polls can't necessarily be that accurate. So for me, it's a very interesting time, because whichever way you turn, it's absolutely different opinions.
Is it an interesting time, Councillor? I mean, it is for the anoraks, isn't it? It is for people who are active in politics, who stood for election at local level or national level like yourself. But I just wonder whether you feel beyond the Conservative membership, for whom this is an interesting thought exercise, isn't it? What do we stand for? Are we about keeping inflation low, cutting taxes, strong on defence, etc., etc.? But does this go beyond the membership? Are you bumping into people on the street, coffee shops, pubs, wherever it is, who actually are engaged with this process?
Yeah, I think as politicians, we are obviously the people who are engaged in the internal politics the most. But for me, people are interested around how we're going to grasp that cost of living crisis. And actually, people are really, have a sense of optimism that people are talking about different policies. And let's be honest, Rishi's approach is completely different to Liz's approach. And that's really healthy. I think it's really getting the Conservatives to have a think about what's important. It goes back to our Conservative values. And we're seeing some really innovative policies and pledges coming out of this campaign. So for me, it's exciting that we're exploring different policies as we move forward. And like I say, I'm supporting Rishi, and I hope that Rishi will get over the line and we'll be able to get a grasp of the things that are important to people, like the cost of living, like the rise in energy prices, but also those solid commitments like levelling up communities like mine in the north.
Jonathan, just before we let you go, we're running a story today. It's our main story, and it's a story based on that RAF base that's not that many miles south of you, down the A1 in North Yorkshire, probably 20 or so miles, I imagine, from where you are. RAF, what was RAF Linton-on-Ouse? It was going to be the site for a major new asylum seeker centre. 1,500, predominantly young men, would have been bussed there, stationed there, cheek by jowl with a village of about 600 people. What do you think of that situation? Is it something which... I mean, it was done to save money, to make sure these asylum seekers weren't being put in B&Bs and hotels at enormous cost to the public purse. But you can see the point of local people, can't you? As a politician, how would you have dealt with that? Is it the right outcome?
Absolutely. I think that the people spoke loud and clear, and for me, it would send a massive concern to residents. And we have to be mindful that this is a quiet village, and their concerns to house these predominantly young men, as you've said, is a concern to them. And the government ultimately needs to look at this strategically and come up with a much better solution on how we're going to deal with this, crisis, so to speak, as we move forward. Because some of the proposals that we're seeing from a local level are just, quite frankly, not good enough.
Councillor Dalston, appreciate your time. Hope you enjoy tonight's event. We'll be looking on with interest. Thanks very much indeed. Christine Hamilton's alongside me. Conservative Party election, it's feeling... It's still going on.
It's going on and on and on and on. What have we got, 3 weeks left or 2 weeks left? Honestly, how...
he'd voted already, hadn't he? And lots of the members have.
I think a lot of them probably will have done by now. What I find so difficult is actually to find out, or certainly to retain, is what the two candidates believe or what they're putting forward about a whole range of other issues. The economy, and I know it's all about the economy, stupid, etc., but the economy seems to be the big dividing line. And if you put 100 economists in a room, you'll get 101 answers to whatever the question is. So I think and they are so divided, economists. The one economist who I have a lot of faith in, and he was the advisor to Margaret Thatcher, of course, is Patrick Minford, and he's backing Liz Truss.
I interviewed Rod Liddle, funnily enough,
Yes.
who's up in that part of the world where Councillor Dalston was just talking
Yes.
from, up in Middlesbrough. The Spectator columnist, much else besides.
Great man.
Great man.
I love
great
Rod
man.
Liddle.
I'll march for Rod Liddle one day when he's been arrested. Rod Liddle said, well, I said to him right at the beginning of this campaign, it's about the economy, stupid. You just said it there. He said, no, it's not. He should have said, stupid. It's not. He said, it's about the culture wars. If you're in the Red Wall, if you're up there in Darlington, it's about all that stuff around identity politics. Do you think he's right?
Well, I think identity politics worries people who are in the south as well. I mean, it worries me hugely. Is there such a divide? Are the people in the north more worried about all this woke nonsense, which is shorthand for
Just quoting him.
politics? Yeah, I tend to agree with a lot of what Rod Liddle says.
OK. Christine, thanks very much indeed.
Coming
Coming up here, it'll be time for Speaker's Corner. Christine Hamilton gets to say her piece. We'll give her take on a topic she's passionate about. But first, the latest news headlines with Ray.
Thanks, Colin. It's 32 minutes past 4. Controversial plans to house hundreds of asylum seekers at a former RAF base in Yorkshire have been abandoned. GBNews understands the Ministry of Defence has withdrawn permission for the Home Office to use the base at Linton-on-Ouse. The community has been campaigning against the move, which they say would have housed 1,500 people and jeopardised the safety of the village. The number of migrants crossing the Channel this year is on course to hit 20,000 within a week. Almost 400 were intercepted yesterday. Sources on the French side of the Channel say thousands are currently camped around Calais and Dunkirk, waiting to make the journey. A cordon around the site of a house explosion in South London has been extended following the discovery of elevated gas readings. A girl, thought to be 4 years old, was killed when a terraced home collapsed in Thornton Heath yesterday. 3 other people were taken to hospital. Residents say they could smell gas for at least 2 weeks before the incident. Energy bills could end up being higher than first thought, with a consultancy firm warning the price cap will hit more than £4,200 in January. That's around £650 more than Cornwall Insight previously forecast. It comes after energy regulator Ofgem announced it's changed the way it calculates the price cap on bills. Thames Water is planning to announce a hosepipe ban in the coming weeks. 2 other companies have already imposed their bans. With temperatures expected to reach the mid-30s, the Met Office has issued a 4-day amber warning for extreme heat across parts of England and Wales from Thursday. We're on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now let's get back to Colin Brazier in just a moment.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Trialling a new feature this week, Speaker's Corner, part of the show where I let my studio guests get their views off their chest about a topic they feel really strongly about. Today it's the turn of author and broadcaster Christine Hamilton, who's with me until 6 o'clock. For the next 2 minutes, Christine, the show is yours.
Thank you, Colin. Of course, MPs and members of Parliament and Prime Ministers must be held to account, and the public has a right to expect that they tell the truth in Parliament and indeed at all times. And any potential breaches should rightly be investigated thoroughly. The Privilege Committee inquiry was set up to investigate whether Boris misled Parliament over Partygate allegations. So far, so good. But Boris has resigned and will be gone as Prime Minister in a matter of weeks. The committee doesn't start until September and could go on for months and months with unlimited powers to call any witnesses whose names do not have to be made public. What a perfect opportunity for anyone with a grudge against Boris to come forward behind the cloak of anonymity. This is not justice, which should be seen to be open and fair. We have all seen these labyrinthine committee proceedings with grandstanding, attention-seeking MPs squeezing every last inch of personal glory. In addition, this committee has moved the goalposts, so all they have to prove is that Boris misled Parliament, whether knowingly or not. That difference is the same as the difference between murder and manslaughter, a crucial distinction which every sane person recognises as a fundamental divide in British justice. The former chairman, Labour MP Chris Bryant, saw that it was improper for him to sit in judgment after making disobliging comments about Boris and Partygate. Bryant recused himself, saying that the committee must, quote, be seen to proceed fairly without any imputation of unfairness, and that the whole House must have confidence in the Committee of Privileges proceedings. If Bryant could see that his position was untenable, why can't other members of the committee who have made similarly anti-Boris comments? In particular, why can't holier-than-thou Labour MP Harriet Harman see that she should never have taken the chair after previously saying that Boris did appear to have misled Parliament? A fierce opponent of Boris for decades, she has clearly prejudged the issue. She would never be allowed to sit on a jury if this were a court of law, where any jury member who had prejudged the accused would have been weeded out and sent home by the judge. But there is no judge to ensure impartiality, just Harriet Harman, salivating at the thought of summoning Boris and skewering him for hours on end. She will relish assuming the role of the infamous Madame Defarge in Dickens' novel The Tale of Two Cities, who led a band of women who knitted below the guillotine as the heads rolled from above. I am not asking for this inquiry to be abandoned. Of course, MPs should be held accountable for everything they say in Parliament. But it is clear to me that the judge and some members of this jury have already made up their minds. How, in all conscience, can they continue to sit in judgment? If they have a shred of decency, they would follow the example of their erstwhile chairman, Chris Bryant, and recuse themselves.
Christian, that was really fascinating insight to the way you think about this, but also the cleft stick that MPs find themselves in, because we like the idea, don't we, of MPs being in charge of the destiny of our democracy. We don't want it to be left to civil servants. We don't really want it to be left to the courts, do we?
No.
Where possible, we like the fate of politicians to be decided by us, voters, the electorate. But on this specific instance, it's going to be MPs who sit in judgment, and your problem is with the particular MPs who are sitting in judgment, most obviously, as you say, Harriet Harman. If not her, then who? Anyone?
Well, surely they can find some MPs who haven't openly criticised Boris. I mean, how Harriet Harman can actually sit there with a clear conscience, and as I made the parallel with a court of law. This isn't a court of law, it's just a parliamentary committee, but it would never be allowed. It does not meet the standards of British justice. I'm not saying that Boris is squeaky clean, far from it, and I am not an apologist for Boris. I don't really.
I'm interested to see, I mean, you've got a lot to say about Brexit, you've had a lot to say about Brexit over the years. Is there not to be something to be said about Brexit in this instance, which is why people may be keen to take Boris down a peg or two, because in attacking him, you potentially undermine the cause that he championed.
Absolutely. There are a host of reasons why a lot of MPs would have an axe to grind about Boris, whether it's about Brexit or Partygate or whatever. And it's very difficult, will be very difficult to find MPs who haven't. But I just think that the current lot on the committee, and as I said, if Chris Bryant, the Labour MP for the Rhondda Valley, can see that his position was not tenable, surely the others can see too. I mean, Bernard Jenkin, one of the members on the committee, has also criticised Boris, although he disputes some of the things that he's alleged to have said. I just think it's
conservative Brexiteer, though.
Conservative Brexiteer. To me, I'm afraid it stinks, and I think it needs changing so to preserve respect for parliamentary institutions and procedures.
Christine, we enjoyed your view. Thanks very much indeed. Different story altogether now. Islamist terrorists are refusing to be de-radicalized in British prisons. This is an investigation by Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, has found almost all Islamist terrorists being held in separation units in segregation have decided that the treatment designed to challenge their extreme ideology is not for them. The revelations come today. Today marks the anniversary of 24 arrests of suspects in connection with, if you remember it, the 2006 liquid bomb plot, a plot designed to bring down, getting on for 10 transatlantic airliners. It was a terrorist plot to detonate liquid explosives on those transatlantic flights. And it's still the reason passengers can't carry containers with more than 100 millilitres of liquid on commercial aircraft anymore, as you'll know if you've recently flown and tried to take them on board. Well, let's turn to Phil Ingram, MBE, the former senior military intelligence officer. Phil Ingram, welcome to you. I've observed, and maybe you have too, I've just been talking to Christine Hamilton about this, it's a view she shares as well. There's an inclination often when we see Islamist terrorist attacks to say these are brainwashed, vulnerable young men, and it's almost to treat Islamism as a kind of mental illness. I've long held the view it's not. It may be a pretty loathsome ideology, but it's a coherent one. And therefore, I'm not remotely surprised that the people who cleave to it outside of prison cleave to it inside prison.
I'm not surprised at all, and there's enough research to suggest that the prisons are, continuing to enhance their beliefs in everything that's gone on. But ever was thus the way with terrorist organisations. Look at Irish terrorists, whether they be loyalist or Republican, in the H blocks in the 70s and 80s. They weren't rehabilitated, although they were in prison. The H blocks were used to enhance their beliefs. The same thing is happening with Islamist terrorists, and there's a danger that it could happen with extreme right-wing terrorists as well.
The way you tell it, Phil, the best we can hope for is simply to keep them from causing more harm inside and spreading their ideology to inmates who hitherto haven't been touched by it.
Yeah, our prison systems are designed to incarcerate people who need to be taken away from the public to protect the public, but to provide an environment to try and rehabilitate them so that whenever they're released at the end of their sentence, because we have very few indefinite sentences, they can go back and be a contributing part to society again. However, we have to recognise that there are some crimes, and terrorism comes into this, where some of the individuals in there will never be rehabilitated. And we've seen that where there have been attempts to rehabilitate them, actually they've bluffed the system, they've gamed it. And that's what happened with the last attacks in London out of Fishmongers Hall.
Yeah, and you can see why there might be a naive determination to believe somebody when they say, I've put all that stuff behind me. It was an affliction of youth. I've evolved, I've grown up. But, you're a former senior military intelligence officer. How do you determine whether somebody's lying?
Well, it's very, very difficult indeed. There are some members of different terror organisations who have rehabilitated both into political systems with Irish terrorism. A good friend of mine is a former member of Al-Qaeda. He did work for British military intelligence for most of his time in Al-Qaeda, so we had many years to actually watch him and see what his motivations were. But those that are carrying out the attacks on behalf of ISIS, who've been radicalised in that way, or Al-Qaeda, and they're operating where they've been radicalised from afar, tend to have slightly different beliefs and fall into a category that I think many of them are in a position where they can never be properly de-radicalised in a way that we can feel safe as a public.
Phil Ingram, I really appreciate your thoughts and your expertise. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Moving on now, our debate this hour. An estimated 1.5 million people visited Birmingham for the Commonwealth Games. They ended yesterday amid some fanfare. Much said about the positive impact of the Games on the city of Birmingham and on the cause of sport more generally. There are those sceptical types who argue that it's all overblown and that much like the London Olympics of 2012, any long-term positive impact is likely to be negligible, and actually it's not worth the candle in terms of the money that's spent. Bearing in mind the London Olympics ended up costing £9.3 billion. The original estimate was about £2.5 billion. So we're asking, will the Commonwealth Games leave a lasting positive legacy for the city of Birmingham and beyond? We're joined by the Conservative MP Mike Wood, who takes one position, and here in the studio is the sports journalist Aidan McGee. Mike Wood, we'll start with you because I think you're cheerleading for the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. Was it worth the money?
The Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games has been a fantastic sporting festival. We've had 12 days of incredible sport across the West Midlands. And talking to participants from countries around the Commonwealth, they think this has been one of the best Commonwealth Games that they can remember. They think it's been fantastic, well organised. But speaking to local communities in the West Midlands, actually they think that this has given a lot for our region as well, that this is absolutely something that was worth doing and frankly should have happened here a long time ago.
Aidan, what Mike Wood says there is, on one level, incontestable, isn't it? If you ask local communities whether they've enjoyed what's been going on around them, they're likely to agree. There's a lot of hoopla and good for local businesses, etc. But the bill for the Commonwealth Games was not that far short of £1 billion. And I'm sure if you lived in Birmingham, there are probably other ways you could spend nearly £1 billion.
Colin, I don't think this is the worst example of profligacy as regards Olympics and athletics and Paralympics and everything else we've seen in the last sort of 20 years. There's plenty been coming back. There's a housing programme being built in Birmingham, which I think will benefit the city long term, probably needs to happen. We're seeing examples of this is the fifth biggest sporting event you can have. I mean, beyond Olympics and football events, World Cups, Euros, etc. So it was good to see it going somewhere other than London, but it's almost the Eurovision of sport. There's a reason why it keeps landing in Britain. It keeps going to Manchester in 2012, Glasgow in 2014. The only other countries able to host this. I mean, if you look at the next games, for example, that would be 7 in total. 6 of those 7 have been held in either Australia or Britain because no one else can afford to host it. Politicians also love the word legacy because legacy doesn't get defined or assessed until 10 years down the line, by which time the politicians probably retired to Cornwall with a picture of a Spitfire. So we have had people actually assessing the impact of London 2012, which in terms of participation, Sebco said in 2006, London 2012 would be judged by its legacy. Now, I don't imagine he would like that question being brought up to him now, 16 years later, but then he probably wasn't thinking of the consequences back then. £780 million is not a huge bill for Commonwealth Games. It wasn't spent at the expense of anything we know in the context of COVID or the cost of living crisis. All these budgets were set down and laid down 4 or 5 years ago. So I don't think it's the worst example of overspending, but when I think about the actual sport itself, it's not elite level sport anymore. First of all, Britain's contribution is diluted by the fact that we had to break up and become England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. That makes us England always land in the second place in the table because they haven't got the contribution from the other nations, and Australia always win. Usain Bolt made some very disparaging remarks about it in the recent years as well, which doesn't help when an elite athlete, one of the greatest ever, thinks it's not worth competing in. And also we have a situation where lots of these sports on these lists, Colin, are afflicted by drugs, and that's the fact. And so, for example, if you look at the World Athletics Championship the other day or the other week, Britain won the 4x100 metre relay. I'm a sports reporter. I only heard of one of the blokes who took part. In the early 90s, even though our athletes weren't quite as good as they are now, they're not hitting the times and the numbers they are now, they were household names. They were getting OBEs. They were on This Is Your Life. They were opening supermarkets. And now we haven't heard of them, and that's because the drugs have meant that the broadcasters and the sponsors have pulled away, and that's had a detrimental effect long-term on this sport. That's not to say, though, that there's no benefit to Birmingham. To say that would be untrue.
Well, I Mike Wood, as you say, there is a benefit to Birmingham, and on one level that's obvious. But just in terms of that key point that Aidan introduces of the sporting legacy, there were very grand claims made about the London Olympics, and we'd all be fitter, we'd all be doing a lot more recreational sport. Bunkum.
Yeah, and obviously this is one of the things that in Parliament we're looking at. Actually, we're not waiting 10 years. As you know, I chaired your party group for the Commonwealth Games, and we're starting this autumn in terms of looking at, OK, what is the immediate legacy from these games, and how do we make sure that that's transformed into something that lasts for the next 10, 20 years, that we do see more young people going into these sports. And we have seen it around a lot of the festivals around the Commonwealth Games, huge amount of effort going into engaging particularly children into some sports they've never been to. So on my local shopping centre, they've had everyone from Worcestershire County Cricket Club and Albion Foundation through to local martial arts and fencing and other sports that may be less immediately popular amongst children, just to try and give people a taste of what these are, to try and find one that fits with young people, in the hope that we may actually, it's possible we may discover the next world superstar, or we may just get more young people in the area who are engaging in sport at an early age, and the huge social benefits that obviously provides.
Or you might get people briefly interested, but then thoroughly disengaged thereafter. That is a third option as well. Sorry, we're quite so sceptical. Mike Wood, Aidan McGee, we're going to park it there. Thanks very much for your time. Christine Hamilton with her thoughts on the spending of these big games and whether it's worth it, Christine?
Well, I'd like to widen it out a bit. I am certainly no expert on sport and certainly not sitting next to Aidan here, but I think the Commonwealth is worth celebrating. And I think the soft power of the Commonwealth is something to be encouraged. And we now have 56 members. There are countries lining up to join. And I think that is extremely important.
They didn't encourage it. They just besmirched it. They brought in a load of left-wing nonsense, not a lot of woke in at the start.
Well,
people don't want to see that.
I was just going to say, I wanted to watch the opening ceremony because what I wanted to see was all the athletes coming in full of hope and optimism for, you know, tiny little teams from the Norfolk Islands or somewhere like that. I think it's the Norfolk Islands with the smallest team. But preceding all that was a load of woke Rubbish. I have to be careful what word I use. Rubbish.
No, rubbish is nice.
But rubbish is nice. But I thoroughly approve of the Commonwealth, and I think we should encourage that. Then it gives us tremendous soft power. And yes, OK, we have to divide up between England, Scotland, Wales, etc., and Australia always heads the medal table. Well, they're an enormous country, so, and they're a bit more sporty than we are because the weather's better normally.
Is it going to last? How many more years?
I think it will. It's going to be a brave person to just call time on it. But the drugs thing is so important here, Colin. I mean, I had my previous employers, we sent reporters to the Olympic Park and they were telling us how the Olympics was going to be the cleanest games ever. I spent the next 8 years reporting on that same channel about weightlifters who died as a result of drug use. And that's something broadcasters and quietly, they don't necessarily come out and say it outwardly, but quietly they've recalled over the last 20 years because they cannot be associated with that. Sponsors, broadcasters don't want to know.
How do you stop it?
How do you stop the drugs?
Yeah.
I don't think you can. That's the terminal problem. Unless there is an argument for letting them take them, but then when people say, when 10, 15 years later they're dying, then you can't do that.
And that is a debate for another occasion.
Absolutely.
Aidan, really appreciate you coming in. Thanks very much indeed. We're going to be bringing you more news very shortly. For now, though, short break.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GBNews.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Just time for 5 to 5. 5 things you might want to know about before 5 o'clock. At 5, a new report's found 20 miles per hour speed limit zones do not encourage people to ditch their motors. Kent County Council issued the report after a trial where they changed speed limits to 20 miles an hour to encourage more people to walk in market towns. Didn't work. At 4, tributes are being paid around the world to the star of Grease, Olivia Newton-John, who's died from cancer at the age of 73. Her Grease co-star John Travolta said she made all of our lives so much better, while the film's director said what you see is what you get with her. At 3, some parents are calling on the York Dungeon to change the name of the Dick Turpin ride because they're offended. No, I don't know why either. Instead, the visitor attraction is being urged to call the ride Richard Turpin, as it tells the stories of the infamous 18th century criminal. At 2, food packaging in supermarkets could soon include eco-labels to let customers know the environmental impact of the food they're eating. Scientists are now able to use public databases to estimate the composition of thousands of food products and their impact, something they've previously not had access to. And at 1, a heatwave warning has been issued across the UK today, lasting through till Sunday. The Met Office forecasting temperatures could reach 35 degrees Celsius in central and southern England. Let's turn to Christine Hamilton. What, Christine, caught your ear there? I'll tell you what caught mine, that idea of labelling food products. Very hard to know what the environmental impact is. It's quite a partial, subjective judgment. I hope it's not used as a stick to beat British farmers with. I suspect it might be.
It may well be. Apparently a vegan sausage is better than a chicken sausage, which is better than a pork sausage, which is better than a beef sausage, but, you know.
Enough sausages.
Quite enough of sausages. But, I mean, the people of York who have objected to Dick Turpin, who has been a British legend forever, first of all, they must have very dirty minds. What is wrong with Dick Turpin? And what about the people who live in Cock Fosters? What are you laughing at?
No, I clearly shouldn't be giggling, but I
should not be giggling.
No.
Pay attention at the back.
Yeah, OK.
It is clearly absurd. And as for this 20-mile speed limit, I mean, that is woke nonsense on stilts, for heaven's sake. People are going to be driving along, looking at their speedometer because they're terrified of doing 21, and they're probably more likely. Yeah. And they've introduced a 20-mile speed limit in certain areas. Wales, of course, needless to say, the flagship for all this rubbish, on what was previously a 60-mile road. I mean, it's madness.
It's quite hard to drive at 20 miles an hour, isn't it? It's quite hard to keep the speed down.
It's very hard. Bad enough at 70.
Christine, get thee to Cock Fosters. Well, let's reflect on more of what's coming up, shall we? No, we won't do that because it's nearly 5 o'clock, but we'll be reflecting on what's been happening up at Linton-on-Ouse, RAF base there. It was the expected setting for 1,500 asylum seekers, put them there rather than a hotel. Well, the MOD has said it's not for us. There will not be no longer an asylum seeker centre in North Yorkshire. It's 5 o'clock. And celebrations in North Yorkshire then tonight as plans for a massive new asylum centre on the site of a former RAF base have been abandoned. Locals said the plans to house up to 1,500 men at the base would destroy village life and could jeopardise the safety of local people. We'll talk to Stephen Wolfe about that. FBI officers have raided Donald Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Our own Nigel Farage says it's a reflection of how America's deep state works. James Dellingpole will join me in a few moments. And as Christine Hamilton was just saying, a report into 20 miles an hour speed limit zones in Kent has found they don't encourage drivers to get out of their cars and walk or cycle more. It just makes life that little bit harder for people. It comes as speed limits on some country roads in Surrey could be cut from 60 to 20 miles an hour under a pilot scheme. We'll speak to the motoring lawyer Nick Freeman later this hour. With me for the next hour, the author and broadcaster Christine Hamilton. But first, the latest news headlines with Ray.
Thanks, Colin. Coming up to 2 minutes past 5, here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Controversial plans to house hundreds of asylum seekers at a former RAF base in Yorkshire have now been abandoned. GB News understands the Ministry of Defence has withdrawn permission for the Home Office to use the base at Linton-on-Ouse. The community has been campaigning against the move, which they say would have housed 1,500 people, jeopardising the safety of the village. A cordon around the site of a house explosion in South London has been extended following the discovery of elevated gas readings. A girl, thought to be 4 years old, was killed when the terraced home collapsed in Thornton Heath yesterday. 3 other people were taken to hospital. Residents say they could smell gas for at least 2 weeks before the incident. The number of migrants crossing the Channel this year is now on course to hit 20,000 within a week. It's after almost 400 people were intercepted yesterday. Sources on the French side of the Channel say thousands of people are currently camped around Calais and Dunkirk, waiting to make the journey. Liz Truss is refusing calls to commit to provide extra support for families struggling with the rising cost of living. That's despite analysts at Cornwall Insight warning energy bills could hit £4,200 in the new year. That's around £650 more than they had previously forecast. The Tory leadership candidate says her current plans would help households.
Well, what I'm doing is making sure people are paying less taxes and also having a temporary moratorium on the green energy levy to save people money on their fuel bills in advance. We'll see what the situation is like in the autumn, but I'm committed to making sure people are supported, and I'm committed to growing the economy.
Well, Ms Truss does plan to cut taxes. Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab says that would be an electoral suicide note for the Tory party.
I think public enemy number one is inflation. We've got to get inflation down. If we don't, then it eats away at people's savings. Any money that is handed back to people through tax cuts will be taken away with higher inflation and higher interest rates on the other hand. And of course, we've got an election in 2 years' time. People are going to judge us on the credibility and the fairness with which we approach the current global challenges with inflation, but which, of course, hitting people up and down the country in the UK.
Defence Secretary Ben Wallace disagrees. He's saying it's wrong to claim Truss's emergency tax cuts would damage the party.
Say a gentle warning to Rishi's camp that, blue on blue is not going to help the Conservative Party win the next election. We have to maintain our brand. I think those type of attacks are unnecessary and actually, I think, say more about, that team than it does about Liz Truss.
A 14-year-old boy has died after getting into difficulty in a lake in Chestnut in Hertfordshire last night. Specialist divers and a police helicopter carried out a search of the area after he failed to resurface after going underwater. Formal identification has not yet taken place, but the family have been notified. Thames Water plans to announce a hosepipe ban in the coming weeks. 2 other companies have already imposed bans as a result of the prolonged dry weather. With temperatures expected to reach the mid-30s, the Met Office has issued a 4-day amber warning for extreme heat across parts of England and Wales from Thursday. A heat health alert is also in place, with vulnerable people being warned they could be adversely affected by the warm conditions. The court has heard there were red flags in the relationship between former Manchester United footballer Ryan Giggs and his now ex-girlfriend. Kate Greville says she told detectives it was almost like he was 2 people. She was interviewed 2 weeks after he allegedly headbutted her in November 2020. He's on trial accused of assaulting Ms Greville and her younger sister Emma. He denies the charges. The NHS has virtually cleared the backlog of people waiting more than 2 years for a routine operation. In January, more than 22,000 people had been waiting 2 years or longer for scans, checks and surgery. Now there are fewer than 200. Earlier this year, the NHS published a recovery plan to tackle the pandemic backlogs. The next aim is to eliminate 18-month waits. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Colin Brazier.
More on that story that broke this afternoon. GB News can confirm that plans to house hundreds of asylum seekers at a former Royal Air Force base next to a North Yorkshire village have been abandoned, not just shelved, completely dropped. It's understood the Ministry of Defence has withdrawn permission for the Home Office to use the base at Linton-on-Ouse. Let's turn to Stephen Wolfe, Director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. Stephen Wolfe, welcome to you. There'll be doubtless cheering up in Linton-on-Ouse. There'll be people thinking we can sell our house again and all the rest of it. But if you're at the Home Office, you're still now scratching your head thinking, well, that was 1,500 asylum seekers. They were going to be kept there relatively cheaply for the taxpayer. Now they'll have to go back to hotels with all the attendant cost.
Oh, absolutely. This is a big victory for the villagers of Linton-on-Ouse, but it'll be a loss for those who will live in other areas of the country. And I guarantee that, as we've seen in Stoke, where there was a huge battle over housing over 1,200 into the city centre, that the northern cities will seem to have the numbers being put into them again. And more than that, Colin, what we're going to see now in the meantime is vast numbers of those people coming across the channel being put in the temporary accommodation of hotels. And as we know, the prices of those hotels are increasing. It looks like it's around £6 million a day, and the Home Office has very little space for anyone to go to.
This isn't much to say for those hotels rather than the RAF base, but I'll say this. In fact, I'll just channel the words of Christine Hamilton, who's my studio guest today, Stephen, and she was simply saying it's a terrible idea. when you've got a small village like this in a very rural and relatively isolated area, to suddenly have an RAF base there with 1,500 predominantly young men, and it's naive to think that that bad things won't happen or may not happen when you've got people who are bored and listless and waiting for determination to be made about their asylum status and all the rest of it, with literally the one shop in the village to excite their interest.
That is true, and I do feel for the people of Linton-on-News, as it would do with any village or small town across the country. But what this is also showing, Colin, is that this is exactly what's happening to those working class communities across the country that have had to house them for the past couple of decades. Last year alone, there was 10,555 Iranians come to the country. We now know that 4/10 of all the people arriving in the Channel are from Albania. So we have these big communities from these countries being placed in places across the country, doing exactly what those people in Linton-on-News feared in their towns. And it's about time that we looked at them as well and said, their communities are changing, their cultures are being impacted, their lifestyles are being impacted. And the only solution to this now is to ensure that anyone coming to our shores is placed in an offshore centre.
But as we know, it's just so difficult to do with the lawyers on hand trying to stop anybody being flown to Rwanda. But just on the points, the point you made about the 4 out of 10 cross-channel migrants for a 6-week period, according to the Ministry of Defence, coming from Albania, a NATO member country. I mean, that is people exercising. I know there'll be people screaming from the sidelines from from certain political positions saying you can't say that, but they are coming 4 out of 10 from a country that is safe. They are making a lifestyle choice.
Oh, absolutely. And when we also consider that within that data, we're looking at 80% of them are young men between the ages of 18 and 55, that there's very few children being brought over from there. What they're doing is trying to form a beachhead for themselves and their families into the United Kingdom so that other family members can then come across the same routes, make applications to asylum using the ECHR definitions of family life. So what they're trying to do is economic migrants using the asylum system, which was not meant for them. It's entirely wrong. These people should be removed. Otherwise, the whole entirely asylum system now will be seen as useless.
Stephen, is it dangerously racist to make the point, as some of the emails I've seen make, that Britain is not an anti-immigrant country, but it reserves the right, people want to reserve the right to determine where large numbers of people come from. So, for instance, I saw one email saying, delighted to see more Chinese and Indian immigration, maybe more immigration from West Africa, but maybe less keen on Albanian immigration because Albania isn't a country which has inculcated values which sit comfortably with our own. Can we have that conversation, or is it beyond the pale?
No, I think we have to have a conversation of whether certain countries would match the lifestyles, culture and values of the United Kingdom. After all, if you look at the way that we've recently decided that we're effectively banning all Russians from coming to the United Kingdom, that's a value-based argument. But my point about this is it's not necessarily about the countries or the cultures. What we should be looking at is purely the large-scale numbers and whether our country can absorb them, integrate them into our nations and make them part of our British community. I don't think we can do that when we've got such large numbers coming in, we can't house them, and all across our nation, we're seeing huge problems from our community. Yesterday, the discussions about dentistry. We've had NHS issues. We've got issues about criminality, issues about our hospitals and schools. All of those are being impacted at the moment. Large-scale migration is just exacerbating that.
Stephen Wolfe, as ever. Stephen, thanks for your time. Let's move abroad. The FBI has raided the home of the former president of the United States, no less, Donald Trump. Agents executed a search warrant, entered the house and broke open the former president's personal safe. The search is reportedly connected to an investigation into President Trump's handling of official papers. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, has more.
Overnight, police blocked off the entrances to Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate as a team of FBI agents searched through his Florida home. The former president was in New York at Trump Tower at the time of the raid. But in a statement, he said these were dark times for the nation. As dozens of Trump supporters gathered outside Mar-a-Lago, his lawyers said FBI agents had broken into a safe in the property and removed papers. The raid was met with anger on the streets here as supporters claimed Donald Trump continues to be the victim of a state-orchestrated witch hunt.
In my own opinion, I think it's another unjust, made-up thing like the impeachment hoaxes.
It never has happened before. They should go after things that are clearly a violation.
In my opinion, this is communism. Right here, you can see where I'm from. I live this. I know what this is all about.
The raid is reportedly linked to an investigation into Donald Trump's handling of official papers after he left office. All official documents are supposed to be handed over to the National Archive at the end of a president's time in office. In February, the National Archive said it had retrieved 15 boxes of papers from Mar-a-Lago. The agency told Congress the documents included some marked as classified.
This is an apolitical investigation. This was something that was signed off by Christopher Wray, the FBI director who Trump himself approved and appointed, and approved by a judge as well.
We will never give in, we will never give up.
There is intense speculation in the States about whether Donald Trump intends to run for office again in the 2024 presidential elections. And at the conservative CPAC conference in Texas at the weekend, the former president continued to hint he may well take another run at the White House.
We have to take this chance to shatter the corrupt Washington establishment once and for all. We have to run aggressive, unrelenting and boldly populist campaigns. Populist, we want to be populist. We want to love our country. That's what we want.
Friends of the former president, including GBNews presenter Nigel Farage, say they're in no doubt the FBI is being weaponized against Donald Trump.
To any fair-minded person, they're going to say, how on earth can this be happening in 21st century America? What have we become? A banana republic? And actually, in terms of the electorate and fair-minded people, it will play very heavily in Donald Trump's favour.
It's unclear whether the FBI intends to go any further with its investigation now that papers have been recovered. As for Donald Trump, he's clearly smarting from this intervention. Many supporters believe it may only serve to stiffen his resolve, ensuring he does decide to run for office again in 2024. Mark White, GB News.
Well, let's turn to the writer James Delingpole for his take on this story. James, very warm welcome to you. Nigel Farage, we just saw Nigel featured in Mark White's report there. He tweeted today that this was an example of the deep state at work. I know it's a phrase, deep state, that Boris Johnson used last month, but for some people it conjures up the stuff of conspiracy theories. Where do you stand on this? Is it the deep state doing what it does?
I think anyone who still disbelieves in the existence of the deep state really hasn't been paying attention. I mean, people not notice that how weird the world has got in the last couple of years. You've got this senile, incontinent guy sitting in the Oval Office pretending he's president, and you've got all these agencies like the FBI, which I think in the minds of the innocent public are still institutions designed to protect the interests of the citizen, acting like the arm of some kind of crazy police state in South America or somewhere. This was undoubtedly a political raid, an abuse of power as well. I mean, you think about how ex-presidents are generally treated in America. They are treated with reverence, like they're kind of national treasures. They get to call themselves by the courtesy title of president long after they've left office. Only President Trump is getting treated this way. And there's lots about this raid that stinks. For example, the judge, the Florida judge who authorized this raid on the President Trump's private property, turns out to have been the attorney who represented a lot of Jeffrey Epstein's associates, including the pilots who flew the various nameless bigwigs out where they had sort of paedophile sex with his underage girls. So the whole business absolutely reeks of corruption. And Farage is right. It's not the kind of thing one associates with the leader of the free world.
And there'll be some people, James, they'll be shrugging their shoulders saying, well, you know, that's just the way it is in America these days. It's that sort of politicisation of the judiciary, lawfare, call it what you like. It can't happen here. It doesn't happen here. And I sort of nod along at that point. And then I think back to that Supreme Court hearing and Baroness Hale and the little spider brooch and why is she wearing the spider brooch? And you sort of think, well, she's making a statement, isn't she? It's commentary. I expect dispassionate lawmaking, and I'm getting commentary. So I think we are a million miles away from America, but you know, we're in the same Anglosphere.
We're not. I think that the problems that are happening in America are happening across the supposedly free world. They're definitely happening in Canada, for example. They're definitely happening in Australia. They're definitely happening in New Zealand. I was brought up to believe that English common law was one of the envies of the world, and that people like to come here to this country to do business because they could be sure of fair trials from our famously uncorrupt judicial system. I don't believe that is the case anymore. I don't believe in, with regards to America, I was brought up to believe there were these marvellous checks and balances established by the founding fathers, which ensured that justice would always prevail. It ain't happening anymore. That world no longer exists.
And for those people who still want to make an impact on public life, James, does that mean they've got to fight dirty?
I think we've reached the stage, Colin, where we have to actually opt out of the system. The system is so corrupt that we have to form our own communities and kind of live parallel lives. It doesn't necessarily mean there are certain laws we have to obey, because otherwise we're going to end up in prison or losing our licenses or losing the ability to spend our money or whatever. But as much as possible, we need to opt out of this system, which is bent and broken and corrupt and wrong. Doesn't matter. You know, you had an item earlier on about you know, the next leader of the Conservative Party. It doesn't matter anymore. Whoever you vote for, you get the same bunch of crooks, I'm afraid. We need to understand that the world is not what we were brought up to believe. It is a much darker, uglier, messier place. I'm sorry,
James,
it's true.
James Delingpole, it's one view. Thanks very much indeed, James Delingpole, joining us there. Christine Hamilton's here listening to that. The world's a dark place. Well, it's been a murky world, certainly politics, ever thus, right?
It's always been a dark place, hasn't it, ever since medieval times and before. Yes, it was ever thus. I mean, man is in the world and man makes things dark, doesn't he? And man embraces woman. I'm not being sexist about that. Yes, I mean, they always say that what goes on in America comes over here next. It disturbs me, that raid on Donald Trump's home. I mean, I don't have a great deal of time for Donald Trump, and I think it's possibly quite likely that allegedly, maybe, perhaps, he did take some files that he shouldn't have taken, possibly, allegedly, etc. But even so, a raid like that, which would have required, Joe Biden must have sanctioned it. This is Joe Biden, who there's a video out there at the moment of him. He's hardly able to put his own coat on, for heaven's sake. And when he comes forward to make a speech, even with a massive auto cue, he reads out the instructions, you know, walk forward, go to lectern. He reads it out as, and the fact that he sanctioned it. So I do worry about it. Let's see how it develops. I feel
Biden defenders will say he's in better shape than that, won't they? But Christine,
of course.
Thanks very much indeed. We've got the weather next.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. Lots more blue sky to come and lots more rising temperatures. We have just issued here at the Met Office this morning an extreme heat warning for Thursday until Sunday, where temperatures will again get into the mid-30s across parts of the south, potentially causing disruption. High pressure is controlling our weather, and as we go towards Friday and Saturday, we tap into slightly hotter air, so the temperatures will just go up a notch. Back to this evening, and for most it's a balmy summer's evening, a bit breezy across Kent and certainly breezy across northern Scotland, where there is quite a lot of cloud. May even be one or two light drizzly showers here and there. But for most, it's a dry evening, a dry and a clear night as well. Maybe some mist and fog patches forming through the early hours. Quite a warm one, temperatures staying in the teens in most urban areas. Certainly a very warm day to come on Wednesday. Any early morning mist and fog across the east should disappear, as it should across Northern Ireland. The cloud in northern Scotland, though, is likely to stick around over Shetland, the Western Isles, but should turn brighter, I suspect, over northern parts of the mainland up through Orkney and elsewhere. Just lots and lots of sunshine, hot sunshine as well. Temperatures a few degrees up on today's values, getting into the low 30s across parts of the south. The coast will always be a little cooler. The cloud and rain will just trickle a little further into parts of northern Scotland during Wednesday evening. Otherwise, again, most places having a fine Wednesday evening, leading to another hot and sunny day on Thursday. Again, just parts of eastern England could be susceptible to a little bit of low cloud and mist, and a bit more of a breeze coming into eastern areas will maybe reduce the temperature across the East Anglian coastline a little bit on Thursday. But elsewhere, again, another hot day with temperatures more widely over 30 Celsius across the south and generally in the mid to high 20s quite widely. A little cooler with that thicker cloud across the far north of Scotland. Lots more sunshine to come as we head into the weekend. As I said at the start, temperatures rising that much further. For more details on that warning, check out the Met Office website.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Lots of emails coming in. We'll share some of them with you now, shall we? Of course, this is coming from... I'm not sure what the name is. We'll try and get a name for you. Of course, Neil says, of course the deep state exists. It's existed for 200 years, but it was called the establishment. Only when it turns on one of their own do they complain about victimisation. The establishment has trampled on the proletariat for centuries, and we have been ignored. Robert says, I think the FBI are trying to discredit Trump before the midterm elections. We do have a shadow deep state government in the United Kingdom, one that's tried to discredit Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. And another viewer makes this point, with the announcement that this army base, this is Linton on News, will no longer be used. I wonder which candidate can really get a grip on this crisis. I think we've let so many things get into such a state of chaos. Where will the Conservatives or any other party even start? Different story. Water companies have promised to make a greater effort to find and fix leaks when a drought is approaching, leading to accusations that they're waiting for a crisis before taking long overdue action. The Liberal Democrats' Rural Affairs spokesman, Tim Farron, called water companies, quote, grossly negligent for not acting sooner. There's been frustration as water companies across England in particular have imposed, well, specifically England, have imposed hosepipe bans on households to conserve water across the southeast. Water companies have been criticised for prioritising shareholders and the bonuses of big bosses, as 2.4 billion litres of water is lost every day to leaks. Let's turn to the director of We Own It, Kat Hobbs, who campaigns on this. Kat Hobbs, welcome to you. You'd like to see the water network renationalised?
Good afternoon, Colin. Yes, so privatisation of our water has really failed since 1989. It's been a story of shareholders benefiting, shareholders making a profit of £2 billion a year, every year. And meanwhile, we are having, nearly a quarter of our water leaking away. I'm sure your watchers, your viewers will be aware of all of the sewage flowing into our rivers and seas. There's over 1,000 discharges of raw sewage into our rivers and seas every day. And our bills have gone up. By the way, we were promised lower bills at privatisation. They've gone up 40%. So why is this happening? It's happening because water companies are prioritising their shareholders and their CEOs rather than looking after our common resource of water and investing in the infrastructure to cut leaks and to make sure that we don't have these sewage flows. So we want to see water brought into public ownership.
Which sounds benign, but it does come with a price tag, doesn't it? If it were to happen, I mean, you'd have to compensate the private companies. I mean, it's easy to sort of demonise the quote fat cats who run them, but actually, in depending on how much compensation you gave, we'd be running a risk of penalising, people who've just got funds in private pension plans who invest in Severn Water and Yorkshire Water and Thames Water and all the rest of it. I just wonder as well whether there's a danger. I mean, right? What was it? Thatcher? Was it Thatcher who privatised the water? The danger is we forget, perhaps, a couple of facts. One is that there are now 10 million more people in the UK than there were 20 years ago. They all need water. Water, for all we talk about it being free, it has to be processed, and that takes money and infrastructure. And there wasn't some sort of halcyon era where some golden age where there weren't leaks. We had a Victorian sewerage system, since Victorian times, and it would have cost the Exchequer and us taxpayers billions to fix it.
That's right. So I think what we have to look at is what's happening right next door to England in Scotland. So Scottish Water is publicly owned. Bills are lower. Their rivers and seas are cleaner. They invest more. So since 2002, they've invested 35% more. So an extra £72 per household per year directly because they're not leaking out money to shareholders. So if England had invested at the same rate that Scotland has, an extra £28 billion would have gone into the infrastructure. Right now, the situation that we have in England is essentially a legalised scam. So water is a monopoly. These companies, there is no choice. As consumers, we have no choice. We have to use them. And they're using their monopoly position to leverage money. So what they've done is, since privatisation in 1989, they've given £72 billion to shareholders. They've built up a debt mountain of £53 billion. All of the investment that they've put into the system, we've paid for. And to pick up on your point about, what about shareholders, let's look at who actually owns these companies. Wessex Water, totally owned by a Malaysian corporation. Northumbrian Water, 80% owned by Li Ka-shing, a Hong Kong billionaire. Wow. Our water companies in England are owned by Canadian pension funds, Australian investors, Chinese investors, Kuwait investors, and the ones I mentioned above. Very, very little of it is UK pensions. So I think what we should do is...
No, it's really interesting. Do you see no scope here for just more regulation to make sure that you've got... The Environmental Agency have said they're going to potentially jail some of the bosses of these water companies when there have been serious pollution leaks. And just on the point about Scotland, I mean, I know the grass is clearly a whole lot greener and more verdant in Scotland, but one of the reasons for that, one of the reasons they can, you know, if you're a student in Scotland, you don't pay tuition fees, is because there is, I can hear the wailing from Scotland as I say this, from the Scots Nats, but there is this substantial cross-subsidisation by non-Scottish taxpayers through the Barnett formula, which is not enjoyed south of the border. There are particular circumstances around topography and geography and their reservoirs as well, which do make it a different thing. We've not had a reservoir built in this country in England for 30 years. And that's a problem with planning. That's partly a problem with planning as much as anything else.
Yeah, the Barnett formula doesn't apply here, though. We're talking about bills. In Scotland, they pay their bills to Scottish Water. We pay our bills to our water companies. Our water companies extract our bills into profit. In Scotland, that doesn't happen. And to pick up on your point about regulation, the water industry has had over 30 years now to get this right. And what really upsets me, and I know it upsets people around the country, is when you look at the state of our rivers and our seas. You know, we're going into a heat wave right now. People want to be able to go for a swim if they're lucky enough to live near water. The fish are dead. People are scared to go in the water because literally 50% of people who wild swim have got ill afterwards. We're having charity rafting events cancelled.
I get all that. Kat Hobbs, you make some really valid points, but I just want you to address the point I did make earlier. In the last 20 years, 10 million more users of these water services. Do you have anything to say to that?
Of course, and that's why we need investment. That's why we cannot afford to have an absolutely failing scam of a privatised system. It just isn't working. And if we made this investment right now in taking back our water companies, we wouldn't compensate them at full market value. That's not appropriate. But that would pay for itself because that would make us £2.5 billion extra a year. That's money that's not flowing to shareholders. It's money from the lower cost of borrowing in the public sector. We are facing water shortages in England. In 25 years' time, it's predicted that that's going to be quite serious water shortages. We should be planning for the climate crisis, and government has a key role to play in that. Nowhere else in the world has sold
we're running way over. We're running way over. Kat Hobbs, we appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Well, there is a response on that story from the utility companies. We'll share it with you later. And we'll also tell you about a report into 20-mile-an-hour speed limit zones in Kent. We'll tell you about those too. Stay with us.
Thanks, Colin. Yes, it's 35 minutes past 5. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. In breaking news, Royal Mail workers are set to stage 4 strikes in the coming weeks in a dispute over pay. The Communication Workers Union says more than 115,000 staff will walk out in the biggest strike of the summer so far. It'll happen on the 26th and 31st of this month and the 8th and 9th of September. The union says it's trying to secure a real terms pay increase for workers. Controversial plans to house hundreds of asylum seekers at a former RAF base in Yorkshire have now been abandoned. GB News understands the Ministry of Defence has withdrawn permission for the Home Office to use the base at Linton-on-Ouse. The community has been campaigning against the move, which they say would have housed 1,500 people, jeopardising the safety of the village. The number of migrants crossing the Channel this year is on course to hit 20,000 within a week. Almost 400 were intercepted yesterday. Sources on the French side of the Channel say thousands of people are currently camped around Calais and Dunkirk, waiting to make the journey. A cordon around the site of a house explosion in South London has been extended following the discovery of elevated gas readings. A girl, thought to be 4 years old, was killed when a terraced home collapsed in Thornton Heath yesterday. 3 other people were taken to hospital. Residents say they could smell gas for at least 2 weeks before the incident. Liz Truss is refusing calls to commit to provide extra support for families struggling with the rising cost of living. That's despite analysts at Cornwall Insight warning energy bills could hit £4,200 in the new year. That's around £650 more than previously forecast. And Thames Water is planning to announce a hosepipe ban in the coming weeks. 2 other companies have already imposed similar bans. With temperatures expected to reach the mid-30s, the Met Office has issued a 4-day amber warning for extreme heat across parts of England and Wales from Thursday. On TV, online and on DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Back to Colin Brazier in just a moment.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Let's give you a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you 1.209 and will also get you 1.181 euros. Price of gold currently standing at £1,486.52 to the ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News, investments that matter.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Just before the break, we were talking about water companies promising to make a greater effort to fix leaks. A Water UK spokesman said that the bonuses of all water company executives are, quote, already linked to performance. That includes performance on leakage, where we are now seeing the lowest ever volume of leaks on record, with further steep reductions planned each year this decade, as well as action on leakage. We strongly support the investment needed to increase storage. So now you know. Emails on housing migrants crossing the Channel. Stuart says, surely the time slowly approaching when there will be no more hotel accommodation. What will the government do then? Sonia says, interesting that we seem to be able to afford millions to house illegal economic migrants, but yet we are having trouble reducing tax to help the country out of the cost of living crisis. And Ken says, Prince Charles opened the Games, and presumably he's referring to the Commonwealth Games, and Rwanda participated as part of our Commonwealth. So how can lawyers and the ECHR say that Rwanda is not safe for asylum seekers? It's total hypocrisy. A report for Kent County Council has found that the 20-mile-an-hour zones introduced in the county have not dramatically reduced car usage. The limits were originally pushed through by Green Party councillors with the intention of increasing walking and cycling in market towns. Some residents even reported increasing the amount of driving they did when the restrictions were imposed. There are now proposals to slash the limit from 60 to 20 miles per hour on country roads in Surrey to try and reduce dangerous driving on those roads. Let's turn to the motoring and road traffic lawyer, Nick Freeman, who joins us now. Nick Freeman, welcome to you. There was an interesting piece by Ian Dale, I think it was in the Telegraph today, saying that the worm was turning against this mania for 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. What say you?
I agree with him.
I mean, 20 miles an hour operates throughout London, and it's had very little effect in terms of reducing accidents. The reason we have a 20-mile-an-hour limit, it's designed for urban areas where we're mixing motor vehicles and people, and it's deemed to be the right balance with safety and pollution. And I completely applaud it and commend it in those circumstances. However, what we have in Surrey is a situation where we have a 60-mile-an-hour speed limit, which was the default speed limit. It's been the national speed limit since 1977. And because there is a small minority of presumably young people who are breaking the law, what's being proposed is that we reduce the speed limit threefold from 60 to 20. And in my view, that's a complete distortion of the raison d'etre of speed limits. Speed limits must make sense to the motorist. And if we have this antisocial problem, which there clearly exists in this area, it's a very simple problem to solve. And it's not a problem that's going to be solved by reducing the speed limit, because those who want to commit these offences are going to continue to commit the offences irrespective of the speed limit. So what we need, and it's not just in relation to this area, it's generally, is we need the police to be doing their job and being on the road, arresting people who commit these offences. So we need a visible police presence in these hotspot areas where they're using their motorcycles and cheap 4x4s in the early hours of the morning, causing a nuisance to people who live by, and arrest them, and then have a robust judicial system which deals with them effectively and operates as a deterrent. And of course, it's a social problem. So we're not going to talk about the education and family problems, but it's a social problem. And it's basically people who have no respect for authority. And because there's no police presence, why should they have any respect for authority? Because they know they can do whatever they want and they can get away with it. So the council's response is, well, let's punish. And it is a punishment, the sensible majority of motorists by reducing the speed limit, and it's going to have no effect at all.
It becomes a form of collective punishment, and it avoids the more difficult job of, as you say, simply policing it and making sure that the people who are doing wrong are punished specifically for what they do. More generally, and we're talking very specifically there about what's going on in Surrey, but more generally, we had the situation in the Welsh borders, 20-mile-per-hour speed limit, later repudiated there. There does seem to be a fashion, rightly or wrongly, a fashion for going, for 20 is plenty. And that will be where it sticks. I mean, is it a fashion which is going to, hit more areas or not?
I think the Green Agenda will try and roll it out across the country. I think that's the plan. I think, look, the plan is to encourage people to walk and to cycle. And in certain circumstances, that's commendable. If you look at the roads that we're talking about in Surrey, I don't see any pavements there. I don't know where people are supposed to walk. For me, there's a balance. There's got to be a sensible balance. There's nothing sensible about saying to some motorist one day, a law-abiding motorist, who going about his business, you travelled at 60 one day and then the next day you're expected to travel at 20. Speed limits must make sense to motorists, otherwise they're simply going to ignore them. And we're going to have a huge backlash from motorists who are saying, you're making it impossible for us to go about our duty. Bearing in mind, we're unrolling electric vehicles. They're extremely fast. They're causing massive problems with their own carbon footprint in terms of the brakes and the tyres, etc., the extra weight. Vehicles are going very, very quickly, faster and faster. The accelerative powers of electric vehicles are faster. This is all part of the Green Agenda. So it seems to be very haphazard. Yes, everyone wants us to go at 20, but the country will not work at 20. It cannot happen. In urban areas, absolutely. Near school areas, absolutely. But let's have a sensible, proportionate, balanced approach rather than just a harebrained idea. Let's have everyone going on the motorways at 20 miles an hour. It just smacks of a ridiculous attitude. It's myopic in my view.
Policing by consent is what we need, isn't it? Nick Freeman, as ever, really appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Christine Hamilton, I'm sure will agree with a lot of that. People struggle. I mean, Nick Freeman was making the point that, there has to be a public buy-in to go along with a lot of this. I mean, open your eyes out there on the roads. I mean, there's plenty of people ignoring the speed limits when they're what they are without reducing them further.
Well, I mean, everybody knows that if a person or a child is hit by a car, there's going to be less damage if you're going at 20 as if you're going at 30, 40, 50, 60, of course. But, I mean, the ultimate argument for all that is just to ban all cars, which obviously is absurd. Well, let's have a red flag walking in front of every car to warn people that a car is coming. It has to be, I think Nick used these words, it has to be balanced. And at the moment, their proposals are I mean, they're absurd. And if people aren't going to abide by them, I mean, you'll have people driving around and they'll just be staring at their speedometer instead of looking at the road ahead.
No, that's a really good point.
20 is so slow. It's not going to happen. I don't think. I honestly think the motorist and people generally will rise up. And I liked his point also about electric cars. And the cost of electric cars in terms of the batteries and the weights and the tyres and goodness knows what, you know, they're not the panacea that they're made out to be.
Christine, no, thanks very much indeed. Moving on to this story. It's a story we've been reflecting on throughout the course of the day. GB News can confirm that controversial plans to house hundreds of asylum seekers at a former RAF base next to a Yorkshire village in North Yorkshire. They've been abandoned, not just shelved, completely dropped. An official statement due from the Home Office in the near future, but it's understood the Ministry of Defence has withdrawn permission for the Home Office to use the base at Linton-on-Ouse. Let's turn to the social policy analyst Rakib Hassan for a view on this. Rakib Hassan, welcome to you. It's a bind for government, this, isn't it? We like the idea of joined-up government. Here's the Home Office saying we have an enormous bill that the public are really unhappy with, taxpayers' bill, to house migrants, asylum seekers in hotel accommodation. So we're going to put them somewhere cheap. But then if you live near the place where the somewhere cheap was going to be, you don't like it either.
Well, I thought it was an absolutely remarkable plan to begin with, Colin. This plan should have never come into existence. What I found really interesting was the complete disregard for the opinion of residents in that local community in Linton-on-Ouse. I looked at the 2011 census figures. The population for Linton-on-Ouse was 1,200. Current estimates put it probably nearer to 1,000. These plans, ultimately, this would have been a repurposing of a former RAF base into an asylum centre, housing up to 1,500 male asylum seekers, men aged 18 to 40. And what I found remarkable was that there's a clear lack of meaningful local public consultation. This was not a minor rehoming scheme by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the number of asylum seekers who are going to be rehomed in that particular area exceeded the population of the established local population, which I think is just absolutely astonishing to begin with.
We had Stephen Wolfe on earlier, Rakib, but he was saying, what's the difference, however? You would probably agree with a lot of what you just said, but he would also say, I think, what's the difference in terms of public consent between having 1,500 predominantly young male asylum seekers here at Linton-on-Ouse or putting them in the centre of Scarborough in B&B accommodation? Where's the consent in Scarborough? If consent's an issue in Linton-on-Ouse, then why not Scarborough?
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that, Colin, you probably agree with me on this, but Northern England on the whole disproportionately does more than its fair share when it comes to rehoming asylum seekers and refugees. And I think this was another example of a failed asylum seeker dispersal system that we have internally, where when it comes to rehoming asylum seekers and refugees, it's not a shared national endeavour by any stretch of the imagination. And I agree, whether it's Linton-on-Ouse, whether it's Scarborough, or whether it's another locality, I think that I think it's important that there's not this top-down planned large-scale rehoming processes, which ultimately show complete disregard for the opinions of local people. And I found it really interesting that in this particular case, Linton-on-Ouse, that perfectly legitimate anxieties and concerns surrounding the degree to which local services may be impacted, matters of community safety, those perfectly legitimate anxieties were almost labelled by some people as forms of far-right extremism, which I just found to be completely insulting.
Rakib, always good to talk to you. Appreciate your expertise. Thanks very much indeed. Rakib Hassan there. Christine Hamilton's alongside me. If we'd had time, I would have got onto this with Rakib Hassan. But, we see with even Ukrainian refugees the difficulties of dealing with people sometimes who are traumatised and assimilating into communities. That problem is magnified when so many of the young men we're talking about here are young men. It's not a balanced picture. It's not a balanced demographic picture. If you were taking a group of persecuted people from, let's say, a Syrian refugee camp, there would be a blend of sexes
There
and
would
ages
grannies
and backgrounds.
children.
Exactly. This isn't what we're talking about here in Linton on News. You're talking about 1,500 predominantly young men, cheek by jowl with an existing settled village. Nuts.
It's all very well to say you must ask people before you do it. Nobody is going to agree, absolutely nobody, whether they're in the centre of Scarborough, I think was mentioned, or in the middle of the countryside. Nobody is going to, any more than people are going to agree to have fracking on their doorstep. It's all very well for the two leadership people to say, oh yes, I support fracking as long as local people agree. Nothing's going to happen if you have to get local agreement. So I think I agree in principle, yes, ask local people. Absolutely nobody is going to say that they want up to 1,000 young, testosterone-fuelled men with no mothers, no children, no nothing, no other sort of normal family members, which actually gives the lie to the fact that these are all asylum seekers.
Could it be done with a smaller number? Does it get easier if you're dealing with, 150? Yes, of course it does, doesn't it? Or 15?
Well, yes, but we haven't got that number of abandoned RAF bases in the country, have we? And it's, they are in a way, they're an obvious place to put them. They've got the facilities, but it makes absolutely no sense. What we've got to do is turn the tap off at source. But that's easier said than done, and time's running out today.
Christine, no, thanks very much indeed. Michelle Dewberry is in position to tell you what's coming up on her show. Michelle.
Yes, evening to you. So tonight, I want to talk about the leadership. I keep saying contestants as though it's some kind of bad episode of The Apprentice. Quite frankly, sometimes it feels like it is. Anyway, the candidates, let's call them that. Are they trying too hard to channel Margaret Thatcher? They're getting a lot of comparisons and criticism. Is that the future, being the next Margaret Thatcher 2.0? I want people's thoughts on that. Also, Linton on News, I know you guys have been covering that today. We'll be looking at that. Obviously, plans there abandoned. So where do we put these so-called asylum seekers? And brace yourself, Colin. I'm going to say something really controversial. Are you ready?
Yep.
Women. I did it. I said it. That's the word. It seems to be the word that's so controversial and dare not be uttered. I'll be uttering it and asking, why are so many people so keen to almost erase that word?
Yeah. Womb carriers is one of the latest alternatives.
Chest feeders.
Women.
Oh, yeah. Michelle, thanks very much indeed. You've started Christine Hamilton off now. She's about to go off on one. Christine?
Well, I mean, it's absurd, all this. What's wrong with women? We all know what a woman is, and the idea that some of these ridiculous politicians can't bring themselves to name it. Everybody knows what a woman is, a proper woman.
We've got 40 seconds left. I just want to go off with this reflection on the Donald Trump story. And I know you disagree with me, but I just can't quite work out whether we obsess too much about American politics. I think there's a danger of being obsessed with everything that happens in America. We tend not to look for our comparisons eastwards to Europe and beyond, even. We tend to look always towards America. I know you'll say it's because
I understand the point you take. I mean, the Trump example, it is pretty extraordinary. I mean, if they'd suddenly gone into the Élysée Palace and broken into that and burgled Macron's safe, I think we would be talking about it. But, a lot of what happens in the States does come over here.
Yeah, no, that's undoubtedly true. No. Christine Hamilton, as ever, appreciate you being in today. Thanks very much indeed. As Michelle was saying, she's going to be thinking hard about women, but also about Linton on News. Still waiting for that official acknowledgement from government that it's definitely going to happen, but there are celebrations, I'm sure, tonight in Linton on News that they are not getting the 1,500 asylum seekers are expecting.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. Lots more blue sky to come and lots more rising temperatures. We have just issued here at the Met Office this morning an extreme heat warning for Thursday until Sunday, where temperatures will again get into the mid-30s across parts of the south, potentially causing disruption. High pressure is controlling our weather, and as we go towards Friday and Saturday, we tap into slightly hotter air, so the temperatures will just go up a notch. Back to this evening, and for most it's a balmy summer's evening, a bit breezy across Kent and certainly breezy across northern Scotland, where there is quite a lot of cloud. May even be one or two light drizzly showers here and there. But for most, it's a dry evening, a dry and a clear night as well. Maybe some mist and fog patches forming through the early hours. Quite a warm one, temperatures staying in the teens in most urban areas. Certainly a very warm day to come on Wednesday. Any early morning mist and fog across the east should disappear, as it should across Northern Ireland. The cloud in northern Scotland, though, is likely to stick around over Shetland, the Western Isles, but Should turn brighter, I suspect, over northern parts of the mainland up through Orkney and elsewhere. Just lots and lots of sunshine, hot sunshine as well. Temperatures a few degrees up on today's values, getting into the low 30s across parts of the south. The coast will always be a little cooler. The cloud and rain will just trickle a little further into parts of northern Scotland during Wednesday evening. Otherwise, again, most places having a fine Wednesday evening, leading to another hot and sunny day on Thursday. Again, just parts of eastern England could be susceptible to a little bit of low cloud and mist, and a bit more of a breeze coming into eastern areas will maybe reduce the temperature across the East Anglian coastline a little bit on Thursday. But elsewhere, again, another hot day with temperatures more widely over 30 Celsius across the south and generally in the mid to high 20s quite widely. A little cooler with that thicker cloud across the far north of Scotland. Lots more sunshine to come as we head into the weekend. And as I said at the start, temperatures rising that much further. For more details on that warning, check out the Met Office website.
Tonight on GB News, at 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners.
Join my show, Farage, 7 p.m.